All right, it is a little after 1 o'clock. Thank you all for coming today for this panel discussion on folk music, Charlie Poole, and whatever else our lovely panel wants to talk about. They have free reign, so if y'all want to get me in trouble, you can. Welcome to the Museum and Archives of Rockingham County. I'm C.J. Idle, the Executive Director here. We're sitting in the 1970 Rockingham County Superior Courtroom. Using the 1970 sound system, I believe. So it's a little warm in here. Unfortunately, our HVAC is not in the best of shape, and I believe the fan has finally died on us. So we have the AC turned on, but it's not blowing. So if you will struggle with us, enjoy this program. And I'm going to turn it over to David Menconi. He organized this for us, and he'll introduce everybody else on the panel.
Thank you, CJ. And yeah, my name is David Menconi. I have been in North Carolina for 32 years, and it's been an honor, privilege, and pleasure to chase the music of North Carolina around. And that wound up resulting in this book, Step It Up and Go. History of the popular music of the state. And chapter 1 in that book was about Charlie Poole. And the man to my left, Kinney Rorrer, he has the distinction of being grandnephew of not one but two North Carolina Ramblers, Charlie Poole as well as Kinney Rorrer, and Posey Rorrer, I'm sorry. Thank you. Sure. And this is the definitive work about Charlie Poole, Ramblin' Blues, soon to be superseded by an updated, improved, bulked up edition coming sometime, probably later this year, from the Country Music Foundation. So, yeah, he'll tell us some stories, of which there are many. To my right, Eddie Huffman, who is a writer and raconteur from around these parts. His book out at the moment, John Prine, In Spite of Himself, came out 7 or 8 years ago, and it is a very fine book, which I would say even though I wasn't the editor on it. University of Texas Press. He has what should prove to be the definitive Doc Watson biography in the works, coming sometime in the next year or so from University of North Carolina Press. We're very excited about that. It's currently being edited. It's a long and winding road, but it will be worth it, I'm sure. And down at the end we have Elizabeth Carlson, author of North Carolina String Music Masters. This was an invaluable source for me when I was doing Step It Up and Go, and I would highly recommend it. And she is a mover and shaker, various projects over in Winston-Salem, which I think she'll be telling us about. But to start out, we're going to have Kinney read from the new and improved and bulked up foreword of his Charlie Poole book. So I will pass the mic over. We've only got one. We're going to be passing it around. So take it away, Kinney.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. At my age, I'm glad to be anywhere, actually. So, and let me say up front, well, two things. One is you may wonder, why do I have all these keys? Well, as a musician, you always want to be in the right key, right? Oh. Okay. Actually, my dad worked in this building for about 25 years. He was the dispatcher for the sheriff's department. And when Mr. Dodson, who was the jailer across the street, took care of all the shut-in over to county jail, when Mr. some of them didn't want to be shut in, but they were. But when Mr. Dodson retired, he gave the keys to the jail to my dad. And these are the keys to that building. That's the jail key right there. That key's probably 100 years old, I expect. I don't know when that building was built, but these are the original keys to it. And I told a young lady, I think, who's in the local historical society, I'd be happy to donate these to the museum if they would put donated in memory of Clifford Rorrer, who was my dad, too. But I would be glad to share these with them and have them kind of bring them back home where they should be, too. Let me say, before I talk to you about the foreword to my new edition of Ramblin' Blues, that the credit for writing the book really should go to my wife, Bonnie, who's with me today. She's my first wife, and I'm her first husband. Anyway, she kept after me to write this book back in the late 70s. She kept telling me, you know, so many of these elderly folks that you have known who knew Charlie Poole personally, played music with you and told you all these great stories about him, have passed on. And you're the only one that knows these stories now. And if something happened to you, I don't think she was planning anything, but she said if something happened to you, these stories would be lost. So I sat down with a yellow legal pad in the bedroom on a card table, and I would turn the radio on UNC Chapel Hill on Saturday nights and Friday nights, because they did a lot of old time music. And I would sit there and work on this book, handwriting it with a number 2 pencil and a legal pad. And one night I'm telling the story of how that Lou Emma, Charlie's widow, had told me. She lived with us when I was a teenager. And she told me that when Charlie had the heart attack down at his sister's house, down near where the Eden Mall used to be, there's an antique mall there now. But his sister lived in a log house there, right up there where there was a car wash once upon a time, a Turner Furniture Company right in there. He died in the house right there. It's long gone. Anyway, Lou Emma told me she kept trying to find Dr. Tuttle. That's when a doctor would come to your house, and she kept trying to call Dr. Tuttle, the mill company doctor, to go down to Charlie's sister's house to see what he could do for him. And she said every place I called, he had just left, or he was headed over to another house. And Lou Emma said I tried to find him, and finally did run him down. And he went on down there, and as I'm telling that story, handwriting that story, I have my ear listening to UNC Chapel Hill, and lo and behold, while I'm writing that story about Lou Emma trying to find the doctor, they play Charlie Poole, White House Blues. And one of the verses in the song, as I'm writing that story about Lou Emma trying to find the doctor, is, "There ain't but one thing that grieves my mind, and that is to die and leave my poor wife behind." That was spooky. That really kind of shook me that line would be sung over the radio to me as I'm writing about his death and his wife telling me that story. So anyway, I did write the book, and it's been out of print for about over 20 years, I guess now, around 20 years. And the Country Music Foundation in Nashville contacted me last December, wanting to know if I would be interested in them doing a reprint of it. I said yes, except that I have things I need to add, there are mistakes I need to correct, I have a lot more information than I once had. Now instead of 82 illustrations, I have 105 illustrations, including I have his original recording contract now, I didn't have it then. I have a copy of a draft card from 1916, which I didn't have then. I have his funeral bill from 1931 for $260, including a plot, the flowers, the hearse, the funeral service, all for $260, which is kind of phenomenal when you think about it. But at any rate, I've sent them all the illustrations, the new and improved illustrations. I've sent them the corrections and the new additions. And so they're now in the process of digitizing it and putting in the new material and deleting some of the other material. And I'm hoping it'll be out by the end of the year. I'm sure they have more projects in Nashville than mine, so I just have to be patient and wait for them to finish. And let me read to you the new foreword that I wrote for the new edition of the book. Almost 100 years ago, a 33-year-old young man who could neither read nor write, on his draft card registration, he lived at Jamestown, North Carolina then, right out of High Point, worked at the Oakdale Mill, and when he came time to sign it, there's an X where his signature would be, and the registrar wrote his mark. So he was illiterate, and my dad, who lived with Charlie for about 10 years, Charlie was married to my daddy's aunt, Lou Emma Rorrer, Lou Emma Poole, which became, Daddy said he remembered very vividly seeing Lou Emma sitting on the side of the bed, holding Charlie's hand, showing him how to write Charlie C. Poole, so he could sign that very contract. And interestingly, when I got the contract, it had been thrown away in the trash, by the way, and the trash man thought it was something important and picked it up and saved it and gave it to a friend of mine in Reidsville, who then said, "You might want this," and brought it to me. But at any rate, he didn't write on the line. He wrote kind of uphill. So even though he could sign his name, he still didn't know how to stay on the line when he wrote it. But imagine a 33-year-old man who could neither read nor write, and who in the slang term of the time was called a linthead. And many of the folks who worked in the mills were called linthead. It was a derogatory term. And my mother worked in one. If she'd worked 3 more months, she'd have been in one 52 years. And how well I remember as a chap, her coming home from the mill, and her hair would be whatever color yarn she'd run that day. Her hair would be yellow, green, purple, blue. And I see young ladies walking around there with their hair dyed yellow, green, purple, blue. And I said, my mother did that, and she didn't have to pay for the dye. I tell you, she was way ahead of them. She was setting a tone for this 60, 70 years ago. But at any rate, he worked as a linthead, and he made the bold decision, and it was a bold, brave decision, to quit his job in the spinning room of the Spray, North Carolina cotton mill. And he'd worked in cotton mills since he was about 8 or 9 years old. Many children did. Almost half of all cotton mill workers in 1900 were children, in fact, under 14. He dreamed that he could make a living through his talent as a banjo player and singer. His banjo would be his ticket out of the world of the spinning room. Charles Cleveland Poole, along with his brother-in-law, fiddler Posey Rorrer, Lou Emma's brother, had won a series of prizes at a series of fiddlers conventions held in Bristol, Tennessee, Kingsport, Tennessee, Greenville, Tennessee, in and around Knoxville, Tennessee. And this was all in the winter of 1924-25, and then they moved over into Virginia and West Virginia and finally went as far as Ironton, Ohio. And these fiddlers conventions were organized by a minister, a Reverend Holder, who was in charge of an orphanage in Bluefield, West Virginia. This is not in the foreword, but I'm just throwing this in at no extra charge. The minister set up these series of fiddlers conventions to pay for the orphanage. It was a fundraiser for the orphanage. And Charlie and Posey won nearly every contest. I have newspaper clippings from the Bristol newspaper, Bristol, Tennessee newspaper, Kingsport, Tennessee newspaper, and first prize on the banjo went to Charlie Poole's. First prize on the fiddle went to Posey Rorrer. And Reverend Holder kept telling them that he would give them their prize money when he ended the tour. Well, they ended in Tazewell, Virginia, way down the mountains of southwest Virginia. And Ernest Stoneman, if you remember Hee Haw, there was a woman on there named Ronnie Stoneman. Well, that was her father. I talked to him twice about Charlie Poole. He knew Charlie real well. And he said that that night in Tazewell, Charlie and Posey lost the contest. He said it was a first. He said these 2 guys came down to the hills, had boots laced up to their knees, covered in mud, so they looked like they'd just come in from the fields plowing. And he said those 2 guys playing fiddle and banjo beat Charlie and Posey in the contest. And he said everyone was stunned. And he said that Charlie and Posey, in their sorrow, drowned their sorrow in some clear liquid that if you struck a match to it, it burned blue. And they passed out for the rest of the night and well into late the next day. And of course, Charlie and Posey had never gotten their money. And when they came to the next day, the preacher was gone with all their money. He never paid them. He took off with all the money back to Bluefield. I'm sorry.
So just in the interest of everybody getting to weigh
Oh,
in,
sure.
could you
I'm
just
sorry.
read that?
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll get to the other stories.
You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. Anyway, confident that his music had appeal, Poole hoped that a record company might be interested in recording their style of music. Poole and Rorrer, along with guitarist, Spray guitarist Norman Woodley, headed to New York City in the early summer of 1925, hoping to secure an audition with a major record label. Having no business agent, the trio took jobs in factories and mills in Passaic, New Jersey to cover their expenses. After a few weeks at work, Poole took a day off from his factory job to go into New York City, hoping to secure a record audition. Unable to read a street sign or office signs, and having a very thick rural North Carolina accent, for example, he pronounced the word fire as far, and he pronounced the word sword as sword. So he goes to New York City asking for directions with that kind of accent. One can only imagine the difficulty, his difficulty in finding his way around the city. Somehow he found the offices of the Columbia Phonograph Company located on the top floors of the Gotham National Bank building located at 1819 Broadway. He boldly asked for an audition. He was told to bring his band in on Saturday, July 27, 1925 for a tryout. They passed the audition after playing only a portion of one song. The recording director, Frank Walker, asked the band to make 4 recordings that day. Despite a bad case of nerves, Walker had to send down to a pharmacy located in the basement to have the pharmacist mix up a potion to calm Norman Woodleaf's nerves. And even Charlie was on edge and swore he would never record sober again. And that's probably the promise he kept. The band recorded 4 songs that day. The first record was released in September of 1925. At that point, Columbia had released only a handful of old-time country string band records, with a good seller selling 5,000 copies and a hit record selling 20,000 copies. Remember, the population then was about a third of what it is now. So those were the thresholds for hit records. Poole's first record, Columbia 15038D, Don't Let Your Deal Go Down Blues, and Can I Sleep in Your Barn Tonight, Mister, sold an astonishing 102,451 copies. While his second release, Columbia 15043D, The Girl I Left in Sunny Tennessee, and what Charlie really sings on the record is The Girl I Loved in Sunny Tennessee, but they couldn't understand his accent. And I'm the Man That Rode the Mule Around the World, based on an incident that occurred here in Rockingham County, racked up another 65,582 copies. The sales of the first 2 records passed the 168,000 mark, while the band was paid only $75 for 168,000 records in sales. Poole would go on to sell over 569,000 records for Columbia, not counting his sales for other companies such as Paramount and Brunswick, and I'll never know their sales figures. Those have been destroyed, long gone. Songs he recorded such as White House Blues, If I Lose, Sweet Sunny South, Milwaukee Blues, and others are still played and sung by bluegrass and old-time bands to this very day. One can say with certainty that Charlie Poole was the first North Carolina country musician to sell over 100,000 records with his very first release. His legacy lives on with those of us who love authentic country music, because he was authentic. He was the real thing. If I can part these 2 papers here. Okay. He lived the life he sang about. When I say he was authentic, he lived the life he sang about. When he sang Ramblin' Blues and he rambled, he lived that life. Constantly on the move, rambling from town to town, though he never drove or owned an automobile. He hoboed on freight trains and slept in barns. When he sang, quote, "The blood was running and I was running too," and "If I Lose," he knew whereof he spoke after breaking his banjo over a policeman's head in a bootlegger brawl. When he sang, "All you rounders take a drink on me," don't take a drink on me, he sang it with authority. In a world of plastic and veneer, Charlie Poole was solid wood. Poole's early death at the age of 39 in 1931 and the crippling effect of the Great Depression on his sales muted Poole's influence among fans of old-time music, making him largely a forgotten figure as musical taste changed in country music. It was not until Harry Smith issued his groundbreaking Anthology of American Folk Music in 1952 that Charlie Poole's voice was heard again on record. Smith included Poole's 1926 recording of White House Blues as a prime example of a standout in folk music. Many young folks at the time, such as Mike Seeger, Bob Dylan, John Cohen, were hearing for the first time the sound of rural acoustic music from the golden age of old-time country music. When Seeger, John Cohen, and Tom Paley formed the New Lost City Ramblers in the 1950s, they often drew upon Poole's recordings as a source of their recordings. They, in turn, sparked additional interest in Poole and his associates. In 1965, Dave Freeman of County Records in New York City took a keen interest in Poole's music after buying an original 78 RPM copy of White House Blues at an auction. Freeman came to the South hoping to find Poole and some of his band members. Though Poole had been long dead, Freeman decided to reissue an LP of Poole's music on his county label. When the album was played over radio stations where Poole had lived and played, there was so much demand for the LP that it outsold the Beatles albums in at least one of the local record shops, Leeds, in Martinsville, Virginia. The manager of that store told me that story. Poole's legacy continued to grow as younger old-time bands began to perform his songs. In the 1970s, the Highwood String Band from New York, led by Mac Benford, played gigs across the United States and overseas, including many of Poole's songs in their performances. In 1982, a biography of Poole and his band was published by Tony Russell's Old Time Music of London, England. County Records issued additional 3 LPs of Poole's music. An accountant and Baptist minister by the name of Rodney McElree from Northern Ireland had earlier come to Spray, now Eden, to erect a tombstone for Charlie Poole after he found that Poole did not have a tombstone. In the 1990s, Louise Price of Eden, North Carolina, later working with Piedmont Folk Legacies, organized a festival in Eden each year to celebrate Poole and other musicians from Spray. That event sparked more interest in the legacy of Charlie Poole. Still where am I? I lost my place. Still more interest in Charlie Poole with the North Carolina Ramblers has been shown since 2000. In 2005, Sony Records, through the efforts of Henry Hank Saposny, issued a Grammy-nominated box set celebrating Charlie Poole and his associates entitled You Ain't Talking to Me, Charlie Poole and the Roots of Country Music. Soon, Loudon Wainwright III followed with another Grammy-nominated CD set entitled High, Wide, and Handsome, the Charlie Poole Project, that included original tribute songs to Poole. BBC crews came from both England and Northern Ireland to film segments about Poole in the town where he had lived and played, as well as the mills where he worked. 2016 saw Bob Dylan quote Charlie Poole by name when he accepted the Nobel Prize, which I think is amazing. When Ken Burns did his PBS documentary on the history of country music in 2019, he included photos of Poole in a tribute to his musical legacy. David Davis, whose uncle Cleo had played with Bill Monroe in his first appearance on the Grand Ole Opry in 1939, recently recorded a tribute CD to Charlie Poole for Rounder Records entitled Didn't He Ramble, using all songs he'd learned from Poole's original recordings. Davis has referred to Charlie Poole as, quote, the grandfather of bluegrass music. Nashville singer and songwriter Tom Utes wrote and sung a powerful and honest tribute to Poole entitled Milltown Blues that made the bluegrass music charts recently. Further recognition of Poole and his contribution to music came through his induction into the Blue Ridge Music Hall of Fame in 2012 in North Wilkesboro, North Carolina. In October of 2022, Poole was officially inducted into the North Carolina Music Hall of Fame in Kannapolis, North Carolina. Literary recognition of Charlie Poole and his musical influence came with the recent publication of Patrick Huber's Linhead Stomp and David Menconi's Step It Up and Go. Okay, mention that. Let's Step It Up and Go. The most recent publication, I just saw this recently in Barnes & Noble, the most recent publication by Bob Dylan, The Philosophy of Modern Song, includes a chapter on Charlie Poole and one of his songs, Old and Only in the Way. Charlie Poole's legacy continues to be recognized. It would seem to confirm what he sang on one of his 1927 recordings, You'll Talk About Me When I'm Dead and Gone. There you go.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. All these years later, people are still talking.
Yep.
So you had a long list of artists there that have kind of carried on with what Charlie Poole started. And there was some, Doc Watson was a part of that too. And I'd like to turn this over to Eddie, who's been working on this bio, to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, David. Thanks everybody for coming out today. And I just want to say real quickly, I would not be here without these two men, probably. Definitely not without David, but Kinney, I grew up in Burlington, not too far from here, and really did not grow up with country music, didn't know anything about country music. And I worked at the Reedsville Review, just down the road, my first newspaper job, and discovered a radio station out of Danville, Virginia, WAKG, and started listening to that, decided I wanted to learn more about country music. Started listening to that on my commute. And also discovered the Saturday Night Hall of Fame. This is back in the 80s, and that was a show co-hosted by Kinney. And he would play music dating back to Charlie Poole, back to the very beginnings of country music, and tell lots of stories, really just, give a a lecture, a history lesson in country music every Saturday night, so.
I can't help it.
So I learned so much about the music, and that's, you know, I would not have been writing books about people like John Prine and Doc Watson without that education from
Well,
Kinney.
thank you, Eddie, thank you.
And David gave me my big break with the John Prine book. He was a co-editor of the series that I wrote it for, and he suggested I pitch a book idea to him, and they accepted it. So I'm grateful to be here and grateful to have had these opportunities. Kinney talked about a lot of stuff that brought to mind things I've unearthed in my Doc Watson research.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about the Harry Smith anthology.
Yeah.
And another performer on the Harry Smith anthology was Clarence Ashley with the North Carolina Tar Heels or Carolina Tar Heels?
Carolina Tar Heels.
Carolina Tar Heels, yeah. Doc started playing with Clarence in the 40s when he was still a very young man, like maybe late teens, early 20s. And Clarence, they would play like auction sales, you know, like property auctions. They'd set up a hot dog stand and have some entertainment, and Doc and Clarence Ashley would be the entertainment for these things. And Clarence was quite a character. He had been in medicine shows dating back to the teens or earlier. I think he auditioned for the Bristol sessions, but was not accepted, if I remember correctly. And just, you know, had a very deep, was in medicine shows with Roy Acuff in the very early days. Just his roots went as deep or deeper than Charlie Poole's in the country music world. So Doc that was one of his first collaborators, first people he really worked with was Clarence Ashley. And then some of the people that were heavily influenced by the Harry Smith anthology and part of the folk scene in New York City, like John Cohen, the New Lost City Ramblers, they put together a group called the Friends of Old Time Music in New York. And Doc and Clarence and some of their collaborators were some of the first people to perform for the Friends of Old Time Music. And that was probably the first time Doc had ever performed outside. He grew up in Watauga County, which is right on the Tennessee line. Clarence Ashley lived just over the line in East Tennessee. And that's the only place, up until Doc was close to 40 years old, he only played up in that area, just, you know, playing for square dances, playing at land sales, just, you know, he was a local musician and just doing local things. And so for Doc to get this break to come up to New York City was pretty dramatic change, and that was thanks to the folk crowd in New York and people that were influenced by those old songs that Harry Smith collected. Let's see. And Clarence Ashley was also the reason Doc was discovered. A guy named Ralph Rensler, who was an archivist and collector, came down looking for Clarence Ashley and discovered him at the Union Grove Fiddlers Convention. And so he made arrangements to record Clarence. And Clarence said, well, let me get my friend Doc to come play with us. And Doc shows up with an electric guitar. And that was not what they were looking for these, you know, classic mountain music recordings. And Doc was like, well, I can just play it real quiet. And so they didn't think it was good, that Doc kind of tagged along, but they didn't think he would end up being on the recordings. They were driving from Clarence's home in East Tennessee up to Saltville, Virginia to record at, I think it was Clarence's daughter's house in Saltville. And Ralph Rensler was sitting in the back of a pickup truck playing banjo, and Doc was in the front of the pickup truck. And he said, stop the car. got in the bed of the pickup with Doc and said, with Ralph, and said, let me see that banjo. And just tore it up on the banjo. And Ralph's like, okay, this guy is the real thing. He may play electric guitar, but he really knows his traditional music too. And so they worked out, they got an acoustic guitar for Doc to play and put him on his record. So that ended up being the first recording session that Doc did. Let's see. And Doc was definitely familiar with Charlie Poole. He did Don't Let Your Deal Go Down many times. Played that in concert. I think put it on the record a time or two. He would repeat songs sometimes on records. And he actually told a story. We were talking earlier about Posey Rorrer. That's your great uncle?
Great uncle.
Great uncle, yeah. One of the things I quote in the book is Doc was explaining how he got his nickname. His real first name was Arthel, Arthel, and he was about to go on a radio show in Lenoir, North Carolina one time, and the announcer said, Arthel, that's a strange name. We need a better radio name for you. And a young woman in the audience said, call him Doc, and probably related to Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson. And that's how I got the nickname. But later on, Doc was telling that story, explaining how I got the nickname. And he mentioned Posey Rorrer. And he said, my real name's kind of a funny name, like Posey. I think that's good for now.
Arthel, is that really how that's pronounced?
That's
I
what I
always
was
thought
told.
it was Arthel.
I think Arthel, I've asked multiple people, and I may be remembering wrong, but I think I've mostly heard Arthel.
Well, no, Gene Ritchie always said everybody called him Doc because he's smarter than everybody else.
Yeah, he was quite an intelligent man. Yeah.
So Charlie Poole is but part of the musical legacy of this end of North Carolina. And Elizabeth, you've been really involved in a curriculum down in Winston to kind of bring a lot of this history to life. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about that.
Thanks everyone for coming out today, and David for including me in this panel. It's really an honor to meet Eddie after I've read a number of your terrific articles,
Honor to meet you.
and to see Kinney again. And so my interest is, as someone who taught elementary school and had a fantastic experience as a kid with a terrific social studies teacher who really brought history to life, is I'm interested in the early years of these musicians, these folk musicians. So that's a lot of the book that I wrote, which includes a chapter on Doc Watson as well as Charlie Poole, tries to put together as best as possible, based on credible historical factual information, what their early experiences were like. And also, I personally had a terrific experience. I grew up in New York City, and it's really interesting to see so many connections between the folk world of North Carolina and people who come down here, like a number of the people you mentioned, from the greater New York area. And I went to a camp that was run by Pete Seeger's brother, John Seeger, in Vermont. And we used to sit around the campfire and sing all these folk songs. And I didn't really know where they came from. And one of them was Tom Dooley. And so when I moved to Winston-Salem 30 years ago, I realized, oh, wait a second, Tom Dooley came from Wilkesboro. This is where it's all based out of. And it just became fascinating, the musical richness of this area in so many different genres. So I started the nonprofit Carolina Music Ways, and we look at the musical heritage of blues, jazz, gospel, bluegrass, old-time string band, R&B, and the music greats from North Carolina, and we go into the schools with a show and also with curriculum. So in terms of Charlie Poole, the thing, I found him one of the most compelling people to do the research on, and very touching as a human being and as an artist. For one thing, he reminds me of Doc Watson and Loman Pauling from the Five Royales, who was one of the very innovative musicians. They were really innovators that were ahead of their time. And a lot of times when people are ahead of their time, they don't get the credit, because people aren't really they don't even understand how innovative they are. So then later on, people get the credit for inventing, whether it's bluegrass or rock, or in Doc Watson's case. Well, Doc Watson did get a fair amount of credit, I would say, yes.
Yeah.
But Loman Pauling and Charlie Poole, and the whole Five Royales and Charlie Poole, really deserve a lot more credit. And I'm so glad that this is happening in terms of the festival and Kinney reissuing the book, because I think it would be safe to say that not only was Charlie Poole the grandfather of bluegrass, but, and I'm going to ask, and I'm going to let Kinney answer this later, and Eddie and David too, but wasn't he also influential in other ways outside of bluegrass and more into country music in general? And then, I'll toss that out later if David wants to continue talking about that. So I find him as a very compelling personal story as well, because his story about And you have to wonder if it was musical genius that was really compelling him, driving him to do what must have had to have been incredibly difficult. So, for example, this story about going to New York. I was mentioning to Kinney right before this. I was nervous about going to New York last weekend because, and I'm from there. I grew up there. I spent my first 15 years of my life, and I've gone back regularly to see family. Manhattan is a very stressful place. It is totally different than any other really place in the country. It's much more like it's one of the biggest international cities. Getting from point A to point B is extremely stressful, even if you're taking, hailing a cab, which is the easiest way to do it. And he probably wasn't doing that. So for someone who'd never been there before, and there's so many people from all different parts of the world. It is not the same cultural milieu, and the types of people you're meeting are from everywhere, speaking all these different languages, and this would have been true also in the 1930s. So the crowds, the tall buildings, the diversity, and just the totally, and then to go into Columbia Records and to go up in the elevator. I mean, even someone from a very privileged Northeastern background, that would be nerve-wracking. So it is absolutely stunning to me that he did this. And it's almost unexplainable, but you have to wonder if it was just this incredible genius and drive that was compelling him. He knew that he could be a major star, and I believe he could have been. I really believe he could have been. So, do you want me to answer about the curriculum?
Sure.
Okay. So, what we're doing in Winston-Salem with Caroline Music Ways and the school system there, the social studies division, is I and another educator who's very experienced. Oh, I wanted CJ to hear this. Well, I'll tell it to him afterward, because it's a great way to learn history through a figure like the Five Royales, is local to Winston-Salem. And it can tie into the state standards, or for here, Charlie Poole, because it ties in. First of all, when you bring music into the curriculum, all of a sudden you get the kids' attention. And there's multiple intelligences, so some people learn through music, some people learn through art. And it ties into, you can tie these things into history. Charlie Poole is a natural one. Of the other North Carolina artists, he would probably be the most natural ones, because he ties it right into the textile heritage of the state. And that's part of North Carolina history. And there's, you'd have to look at the curriculum standards. But I think it'd be great if some teachers in this county worked with the curriculum specialists here to put together some kind of curriculum. And we're just talking 20-minute lessons, because elementary school is very short, at least in Winston-Salem. And I just think these are incredible American historical figures. And they need to, and young people really can learn a lot, not only about the people, but about the history that's around these people, when, where they're from, textile center, and what's going on in the state and nation at the time.
I was just going to suggest maybe do just a very brief history of the Five Royales for people who may not be familiar with them. Why they were so important.
Oh, well, the Five Royales, it's very similar. They were kind of ahead of their time. They're an early R&B group from Winston-Salem. They came right out of the gospel church. They kept their gritty gospel sound when they were asked by the record company up in New York to change over to R&B. And so you've probably heard the song Dedicated to the One I Love. Think this was their song. But they had a very earthy sound. Johnny Tanner was the lead vocals, and this was the inspiration for people like James Brown, for example, who modeled himself largely on the Five Royales. But also their guitarist, Loman Pauling, was very innovative. And although the Beatles, I think, get credit for feedback, intentional feedback on electric guitar, music historians say the first time it's ever heard on record was Loman Pauling, but he didn't get the credit. And so that's why the editor of Rolling Stone magazine says David Frick that he considers the Five Royales the first R&B group. I mean, excuse me, rock group, the first rock group. And so, you know, it's similar to Charlie Poole, where he had this humongous, innovative quality and influence on the history of American music. But because he was ahead of his time, and because he died young, he hasn't gotten the full recognition. I would love to see him inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. I mean, it's kind of a crime he isn't there, just like it was a crime that it took so long, and finally now the Five Royales are there. But you just wonder, I'm sure this is true in every area of life, that the people you never hear of are actually some of the major players. So that's all I have to say for now, but I'm eager to hear more of what you guys have to say.
Thank you. And I do have a chapter on the Five Royales in my book. Because I am a hopeless dork, I made them chapter 5. The chapter about record companies was chapter 11. As in the like I said, I'm a hopeless dork. But and yeah, Charlie Poole, to me, when I was first trying to do this book, I didn't want to do just a series of disconnected encyclopedia entries. I wanted to do a linked narrative that told kind of a single story with all these different threads to it. And Charlie Poole was kind of the ultimate example of my underlying premise that North Carolina music is this strong, populist, blue-collar tradition, more so than a lot of places. And it comes out of just a basic kind of innate hard-headedness in a wonderful way of the people of the state and their determination to make it at all costs. And he was an obvious one to start with, and that is why he's chapter 1. And I'm going to read a little bit, if I may be so bold, from the prologue of my book, which kind of sets the scene for the whole thing. And it is the first time I ever heard Charlie Poole's name. Before I moved to North Carolina, I knew next to nothing of the state's music history. I had heard of Doc Watson and Earl Scruggs, and heard some of the North Carolina-based acts on college radio, and the underground rock couch circuit that extended to Texas and Colorado, my previous states. But beyond Doc, Earl, Let's Actives, the DB, Superchunk, and a handful of others, I was the blankest of slates. Turns out I had no idea what I was missing out on. That began to change one spring morning a few months after my arrival with a visit to Alice Gerard's house. At the time, Gerard was editor of the Old Time Herald, a magazine chronicling venerable folk music of the southeastern U.S. Gerard wasn't just the editor, she was something of an old-time legend herself, formerly one half of Hazel and Alice, a pioneering folk duo that had been particularly inspirational to younger generations of women artists starting in the 1970s. I'd been hired as a new music critic for the Raleigh News and Observer, and I had an assignment to do a Tar Heel of the Week interview profile of Gerard. So I drove over to her home near Durham's Maplewood Cemetery, nestled between the Duke University campus to the west and the city's then decaying downtown to the east. I found it comfortably cluttered with instruments, books, and a large dog curled up on a rug. The faint smell of that morning's bacon still in the air in the kitchen. 24 years later, in 2015, when Gerard was nominated for a Grammy Award at the improbable age of 80, I would return to her house for another interview. It looked like the only thing to have changed in the interim was that she had a different dog. Gerard was a wonderful interview subject and gracious host, but what I remember most about that first visit was her blowing my mind when she pulled out a well-worn vinyl copy of the Anthology of American Folk Music. A 6-record compilation of Depression-era recordings, Anthology dated back to 1952, compiled by the legendary and eccentric musicologist Harry Smith. When the folk revival swept college campuses in the 50s and 60s, Anthology was the spark that lit the fuse, serving as sacred text repertoire for Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and other acolytes. That much I knew. But I'd never seen a copy before, let alone heard it. This was years before Anthology would be reissued on compact disc with much fanfare, in parallel with the oracular music critic Greil Marcus's 1997 book, Invisible Republic, where Marcus put forth the novel thesis that the songs on Anthology mapped out a mythical universe he called the Old Weird America. In 1991, Anthology was still obscure and hard to find, Gerard's copy looked as if it had been handed around a lot over the previous 4 decades. A friend had this, Gerard told me, putting disc 5 under a turntable and dropping the needle with a crackle. Track 1 was The Cuckoo Bird, a recording dated back to 1929. The music sounded nervous, jittery, and old as the hills, a banjo rambling along like a stream rushing downhill, seeming to double back on itself. Over that backdrop, Clarence Tom Ashley drawled his tale, sounding like a mysterious and ghostly apparition. Gonna build me a log cabin on a mountain so high. I'll spare you me trying to sing. That morning was bright and sunny outside, but it suddenly felt like a thick morning fog was rolling into Gerard's living room. The verses seemed like a string of non sequiturs about faraway places, card game tricks, robbery, a bird taking flight, and that banjo. It may sound strange to your ears, Gerard said, as Ashley's banjo rolled along, but that banjo is just an incredibly beautiful, mournful sound to me. I loved it as soon as I heard it. I really like the old mountain songs, the old mournful songs. When you play them, you can put more into them. There's not much between the tune and what you're feeling. She was right about that. It did sound strange. It sounded not just old, but ancient, from a long vanished era. I would later learn that the cuckoo bird came to America from England and had been around for lifetimes before Ashley got to it. A decade after I first heard it, Dylan would quote cuckoo in his apocalyptic song, High Water, released the day the Twin Towers of New York City's World Trade Center fell on September 11, 2001. Yet in that first encounter with Gerard and the song, the biggest revelation of all was not time but place. This particular version of the Cuckoo Bird had come from surprisingly close by. Did you know Clarence Ashley was from North Carolina? Gerard asked. I had to admit I did not. I'd never even heard the man's name before that day. Yeah, she said, he played in an old-time band called the Carolina Tar Heels. Died in Winston about 25 years ago. The record continued playing as we talked, and the Cuckoo Bird faded out to the next song, East Virginia, by the Kentucky-born hillbilly singer Buell Kazi. The opening couplet caught my ear. Oh, when I left old East Virginia, North Carolina did I roam? And I pointed out the reference. Gerard nodded as she laughed knowingly. Oh, North Carolina's all over anthology, she said. Bascom Lamar Lunsford, the Bentley Boys, and Charlie Poole. You know him? That's something you should hear. Somewhere in the course of that conversation, a door opened. So I went through it. One way or another, I have been chasing after the history of North Carolina's popular music ever since. And Charlie Poole was someone that I caught up with about 14 years after that, when the box set Kinney mentioned came out, You Ain't Talking to Me, and it was just a real revelation. All these different threads of things he brought together, medicine shows, old blues and gospel, and hillbilly songs he tracked down, and he, this former mill worker who, as was noted, had the nerve to go up to New York. It just was an incredible, inspiring tale, and an obvious chapter one for me. So, at a certain point, we're going to get into questions. We could start working those in now if anybody's got any. Shout them out, and I'll repeat them on the mic.
Me?
Yes.
Question for you. You mentioned how much those records sold.
Right.
And we know that records were not played on the radio back in the 20s. How did that, word of mouth or what? What are your
That's
thoughts on that?
a great question. It surely is. Yeah, it was primarily word of mouth too. Someone would visit their neighbor and they'd say, I got Charlie Poole's latest record. And they'd play it for them and say, well, I want that record. And next thing you know, they're at the record store buying that record. I think it's interesting, and I meant to mention this earlier when I was doing the forward there, and it slipped my mind, but I was talking about Charlie's thick accent, and the girl I left in sunny Tennessee, and Charlie's really singing the girl I loved, or he said the girl I loved in sunny Tennessee, as people would say once upon a time, he said the girl I loved in sunny Tennessee. But I have at home a 1920, I know this is more than you asked for, but I can't help it. I have at home a 1929 stock book from a record store that tells the clerk how to find records for the customer who comes in and wants a record. And it's a Victor stock book. And Victor coded their records by numbers. And they put out foreign language records because we had a very diverse population in Detroit, New York, Chicago, and places like that. And the way the thing is set up on the first page of the book, it says series number, and then it says language spoken. And it starts off like V1000, Victor 1000. Victor 1000 series, Spanish. You know, so if a Hispanic customer comes in and they want something, you know, in their native tongue, the guy goes to the stock room and looks through the V1000 records. V2000 Greek, V3000 Polish, V4000 German. And you get all the way down finally to V40,000. And I have V40,000 in my collection. It's Wildwood Flower by the Carter family. And it says series number V40,000, language spoken Southern. So we were listed with the foreign language records. And when Charlie Poole says things like sword and far, you can tell it on some of the record labels. I have a record by a group called East Texas Serenaders. And on the record, it's listed as FAR in the mountain. The tune is a fiddle tune called Fire in the Mountain. But they asked those, you know, these guys, the A&R men who ran the studios were from up north. They'd never heard this music. And so we went with the foreign languages. And when they asked that East Texas fiddler what was the name of that, they didn't know the name of it. You know, the New York A&R man didn't. He said, well, that's Far in the Mountain. So they put FAR. I have another one that's called Green Mountain Poker, P-O-K-E-R. The tune is really Green Mountain Polka. You know, probably the funniest one I have is a banjo player from St. Louis who recorded the tune, and on the label, on the OK record, it's listed under two words rather. The first word is D-A-M-F-I-N-O. The second word is S-T-U-M-P. And I think they asked the guy, what's the name of that one? He said, Danfano. A stomp. And so they put Danfino Stump. So in our own country, mind you, we were listed with the foreign language records. And when Charlie Poole says sword and far and hot and those kinds of things, that was something, an old weird American, it was something they were not used to. And it's a music. But the short answer to the question is word of mouth.
I mean, records just were not played on the radio at that time.
No. In fact,
Live.
on the records from the 30s, particularly the early 30s, on the record labels, and I have a lot of them that have on there not licensed for radio broadcast, because the companies like Columbia did not want their records played on the radio. Because if the person heard the record on the radio,
Why buy it?
why buy it? You could hear it, you know, for free. Of course, you had to buy the radio, and they weren't cheap.
I was gonna say, a lot of people didn't have radios yet either.
Exactly. So they didn't want and it's ironic that they felt that way, because the truth is, when it's played on the radio, people say, well, I want that record because I want to play it whenever I want to hear it. You know, instead of having to wait for, you know, them to recycle it tomorrow, next week or
I
something.
don't know anyone like that.
Right. Okay.
There's a book by Barry Mazur, M-A-Z-O-R, about Ralph Peer that really gets in the weeds on this, that whole transition of the radio industry, you know, when they were just doing live performances and gradually got into records. It's quite a story, and took a lot longer. It seems obvious in retrospect,
Yeah.
but it took them a long time. And another way records were promoted back then, railroad guys from up north would go all over and bring records around. So that was another avenue. Any other
Like
questions?
the sailors in Liverpool bringing the 45s from America.
That's right. Other questions, comments, observations, jokes?
I could use some new ones.
I have a comment.
Please.
So, you know, one thing that I bring to this whole topic of North Carolina music and culture is my ignorance. And in some ways, it's a benefit, because when you're talking to people, it's good to be able to communicate in such a way that's clear. So for example, when I came here, people were talking about old-time music, hillbilly music, Appalachian music, mountain music, and I thought there was a difference between all these things. It took me years to realize they were talking about the same thing. Okay, but that's just to explain why sometimes ignorance can be a plus. So what else was I ignorant about before I studied Charlie Poole? The textile industry and how essential it was, to many states. And of course, I believe it started in New England and then it moved down here because there was cheaper labor. So growing up in the Northeast, I saw the textile mills, around like Lawrence and Lowell, and they had been long abandoned. But I did not understand when I moved here how much this state, how many people in the state have ancestors who worked in the textile mills, how it's part of the culture, because by 1995, when we moved to Winston-Salem, most of the mills were closed. There was one still operating off of Stratford Road, Haynes, so for people who move here, and there are many people who move to North Carolina, as you know, and also in terms of young people, I don't think there's the understanding of the textile heritage. And that's another reason I think that Charlie Poole is such a natural for teaching in elementary school, because he so much ties into it. And it was so much a part of who he was. He started work, he grew up in Millborough for the first 8 years in Alamance County, with 3 mills within walking distance of the home, and his older siblings and father worked there in those mills. Then he moved to Haw River, and that was a very bustling mill town with some diversity there, because there were Germans and the German instruments like the accordion. There, of course, were the Scots-Irish, there were African Americans, and I don't know if there were any other groups there that brought their instruments. There may have been one other. But he was exposed to records there, because it's likely that he would have gone into some of the wealthy people who own the mills' homes, like open houses or maybe play date even, and heard records, or maybe at the store, the general store. So he was exposed to a variety of music, but he was working in the mill as a kid. Wasn't it 8 years old he started?
Yeah.
Very stressful. He was a doffer. I'm sure, a lot more about this, Kinney. This is your heritage. But I believe it was very stressful work, because if you didn't get the spool off on time, it could be dangerous. So he then worked in mills in Jamestown, I think for about 7 years in the Greensboro area, and then he moved to Spray, which of course is now Eden. So his whole life was tied in to the life of not only working in the mills, but the whole world around the mills. It was a whole village and a whole community. And one thing I found so interesting was that the mill owners brought in top-notch music teachers from Europe. And you probably, Otto Kirchhoff, I think.
Kirchhoff is pronounced, yeah.
And then Manker from
Paul Manker from Norway.
And so there was really terrific, formal music instruction, including classical, right? And there were chamber music groups and choral groups. It was in addition to the string band, that these families were bringing in, because a lot of them came from rural areas, including the mountains and all over the Piedmont. So it was, not only is it interesting in terms of the history of our country, and this is where our cloth comes from, but just also the kind of close-knit community of these textile villages, and how when those communities no longer have the mills there, so many things that are associated with the mills start to fall apart, and it kind of helps explain some of the things we see in the country today with, alienation, where the communities aren't as tight as they were. So I just think, and what happens when these jobs, go overseas, and what happens to the communities where they leave people behind. So I just find the whole life story of Charlie Poole and the culture he grew up in so fascinating from a personal point of view and from a historical point of view. I think it has just about everything you could want for a great read for a chapter, or great potential curriculum for kids.
You mentioned songs that, I'm sorry. You mentioned songs there. I used to quote lyrics to songs to my students when I was covering a particular period in history, and when I would cover, the early 1900s and child labor, I would quote songs about that. And when I would do the Great Depression and the mills, I would quote Dave McCarn's Cotton Mill Colic and Wilmer Watson's Cotton Mill Blues to my students. And I used to get a kick out of their expressions when I would never sing them to them, but I would always quote them to them. But I used to carry in my billfold, I carried it till I finally had to have it laminated because it was coming apart, a pay stub for a mill worker from 1932. And he worked in the mill in Martinsville in Henry County for 24 hours on short time. So he worked a whole week. It was only 24 hours work. And his total paycheck for the week, his pay envelope, was $2.34. And I would show that because I told my students, if I just told you this, you probably wouldn't believe me. You'd think it was a yarn. See, it was a mill village thing. I always shuttled in a few more of them. But I see their heads bobbing up and down. But anyway, I would show them that pay stub. I'd pass it around, and I'd get a student I said, read out to the class how many hours he worked. Well, he worked 24, Mr. Rorrer. I said, pass it to the next one. How much did he make? $2.34. I said, and you think that, and I'd turn into my sermonette number 101, when I would say, you think this guy worked in a hot, sweaty cotton mill as a lint head, and what would he have given to have been in an air-conditioned classroom, taking notes, and writing the teacher's jokes, of course, but taking notes and jokes from your teacher, and what would they have given to be where you are now? And what are you doing with an opportunity that they would have given anything for? You see, I turned it in my sermonette number 101, that you need to take advantage of every opportunity and not just sit there. You think of the difficulty that those people had, and particularly with child labor. I'd show them Lewis Hines photographs from the early 1900s of all the child labor, and they're just heartbreaking photographs that he made of those kids, 5 years old. I had an elderly lady, and I'll stop with this story, but I'm trying to be succinct here, but I don't know how. I had a little old lady in my class, this is 40 years ago, named Mrs. Mrs. Ethel Nick, and she was an old lady to me. She was about my age now. I thought she was a really old person, but she would have been about my age now, taking my U.S. history class. And when I talked about Lewis Hine and told about the child labor in the mills, about half of the people who worked in the cotton mills in the South, and there were over 1,400 of them in the South, more than 600 within 150 miles of Charlotte, North Carolina. It was one long cotton mill village from Lynchburg all the way down to Alabama. But anyway, she raised her hand. She said, may I say something, Mr. Rorrer? I said, absolutely. She said, I grew up in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And she said, when my mother died a few years ago, in her 80s, she said, my mother went to work in a Darlington, South Carolina cotton mill when she was 5 years old. And she said she worked in the mill till she was 65. She worked there for 60 years. And she said, she held up her hand, she said, my mother's fingers were not rounded on the ends like yours and mine. She said, my mother's fingers came to points on the end. They were pointed. And she said it's because as a 5-year-old, she started pulling threads on the looms and the bobbins. And she said, my mother wasn't through growing. She was only 5 years old. And the result was it misshaped her fingers into points. I could have hugged Ms. Nixon neck for that. I said, thank you for sharing that story with my students, because if I'd have told it, they wouldn't have believed me. But it was her mother that she was talking about. And I don't think people realized, Charlie Poole's banjo and voice was his ticket out of those kinds of conditions, who went to work as an 8-year-old. That's my version of succinct.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Elizabeth, to bring that sort of textile history into schools and just make sure people are aware, because that's a huge part of my family story. My great-grandfather went to work in a mill when he was 7 years old, my mother said. And Kenny, you just mentioned that the sort of the giant mill village from Lynchburg, Virginia to Alabama. My mother's family, her father was a mill supervisor, and they moved from Alta Vista, Virginia to Burlington to Anderson, South Carolina, just kind of up and down that circuit.
Yep.
And let's see, and my grandfathers worked on sort of opposite sides of the Union divide. One of my grandfathers tried to start a union at the mill in Gibsonville, I'm told. I never heard a lot. My father was anti-union because he didn't get along with his father.
Yeah.
In part, so I never heard a lot of stories
What a
about
surprise.
that. But my mother's father was a supervisor at Plaid Mill in Burlington. She remembered him wearing a pistol to work during some of the uprisings in the 30s, back when they would call out the National Guards and shoot strikers and all that sort of thing. There was actually a bombing at Plaid Mill in the 30s in Burlington. Let's see, and there was, another detail on that. I was going to say, Tommy Sweeney, who asked the question about radio play earlier, there's a great book called Like a Family about,
I got it.
yeah, and Tommy's, I think your grandfather is in there?
Yeah, he's in about 8 pages, actually.
Yeah. But it's all about that sort of, the history. It's from UNC Press, and it's about that history of I think it's called The Making of a Cotton Mill World.
It's an oral
something
history,
like that.
basically.
Yeah. Oral history of that textile heritage, so I highly recommend that for anybody that's interested in that legacy. It's a great resource.
I'd also like to note, how many people in this room know B.J. Barham? Couple. He grew up in Reedsville, North Carolina, and went to NC State, but he started a band called American Aquarium that are kind of king of the scene over in Raleigh. And
My son plays keyboards.
and Eddie's son plays keyboards, right? And they are a touring national act. They play about 100 dates a year all over. And had Charlie Poole kind of settled down, straightened up, quit drinking, he probably would have been something like B.J. Barham, who has built himself a very impressive music biz empire. All very hands-on. He puts his own stuff out. He manages his own career. He's large and in charge, and someone I respect the heck out of. And right here in Reedsville, he did a solo album called that a number of years ago. But yeah, American Aquarium, they'll play soon in a town near you, I'm sure, because they're one of the hardest working bands in showbiz.
I have a brief
They
BJ
just
story.
played
I've
the
got to-
Ramcat, didn't
They did, yeah.
they? A couple days ago.
Yep. One of my favorite BJ stories. BJ freely admits that he's a changed man from who he was growing up. He was quite a character. And I was talking to somebody at a party in Greensboro a few years ago and realized that she was from Reedsville and about the same age as BJ. And I said, did you know BJ Barham? And she got this stricken look on her face. And she goes, BJ could burn down a church with his heart. Which is one of my favorite quotes of all time. So.
I think there was a
I'll say,
question now.
yeah.
Another question? Yes, ma'am.
Oh, it's not a question, it's mostly an observation. One, I've really enjoyed the book. The second one is this talk of the history of the music and the time period. Also has to be a talk about race, because you get very two distinct narratives, and I think that is interesting, especially when the music is intersect with everybody. But you also get these two different perspectives that's going on as well.
I always found it fascinating that the textile industry was white and the tobacco industry was people of color. And, you know, it's just very strange the way that broke down. But Durham, the big tobacco town, that was the big blues scene back in the 1930s, not long after Charlie Poole's heyday.
Oh, can I comment on that?
Yes, please.
Okay, so that's something that I found really fascinating is the thing that got me interested here in North Carolina was I was listening to Across the Blue Ridge, which was a radio show a number of decades ago by Paul Brown on WFDD, and the segment I happened to just tune into, he was talking about the banjo coming from Africa. Well, I was ignorant, I didn't know that. I said, you're kidding me. I just thought of Beverly Hillbillies type, you know, and they're poor, I didn't know that. So that got me really interested in all this. And our show, Carolina Live, our musical history, that's one of the things we stress about how, you know, the fiddle came, and I do this in the book as well, the fiddle came from Africa, Europe, the banjo came from Africa, and these two instruments and music styles kind of mix with each other. So there's a lot of African musical influence in all these musical styles. I mean, of course, different songs will have varying degrees, and some will have a lot, and some may have very little. Some may sound almost like Celtic music, and others going to have more of the African influence. But I thought, wow, that's fascinating. Most people don't know that this hillbilly, mountain, Appalachian, old time, whatever you want to call it, African Americans were playing this music. And so in my book, like, there's a chapter on Joe Thompson, and he and Odell were playing old time music from a continuous line of old time spring band musicians over in Mebane, and they were in Orange County, I think, originally. And because this is what their ancestors were playing. So the type of music and dances that they were involved with were very similar to the ones Tommy Jarrell and his family were doing in Surrey County. So I found that fascinating. And I think it's just something, again, that most people just don't know about the heritage and how in music especially, look at Charlie Poole. His hero was Al Jolson, who was born in a Jewish shtetl in Lithuania. But, you know, he came to the United States as a kid. I think his father or grandfather was a cantor, and that's a very musical tradition, just like the Scots-Irish have a very musical tradition. African Americans have a very musical tradition. So I just think it's very cool how all these different musical traditions and these talents kind of draw from each other. And I think that's an excellent point you're making.
And I'll just note that Joe Thompson was mentor to the Carolina Chocolate Drops. And he was delighted that they came along when they did, because the tradition had almost died out at the point when he kind of took them under his wing. One quick thing I'll note before passing it back to Eddie. This program is under the auspices of North Carolina Humanities, their statewide book club, North Carolina Reads. There is an online Zoom meeting for my book, which is the last one in the series this year, on June 27th. If you just Google North Carolina Humanities, North Carolina Reads, you can find that. Free to attend. Hope you'll drop by. Elizabeth will be asking some questions there too, I believe. And it's going to be me and Dolph Ramser, who's the manager of the Avett Brothers, talking about North Carolina music and the music biz. And Eddie, you mentioned you had something?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention briefly that there's been a great effort in just the last few years to sort of bring African Americans back to country music, or to reopen country music. That there's a great tradition there, but for decades, African Americans were basically excluded from country music. There was a great harmonica player with the Grand Ole Opry named DeFord Bailey, who played, I guess, up into the 40s, Kinney?
Yeah, he left the Opry, I think, in 41, I think it was.
Okay.
He went on the Opry like in 27, maybe.
He was an original member of the Opry.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was one of the original Opry.
But for the past few decades, it's been a lily white institution, country music. And Reese Palmer in particular, who's had some country hits in the last 20 years or so. She lives in Durham now, I think.
Yes.
She's got a radio show called Color Me Country. She just had did a stage at, I can't remember what the event was. There was a big event in Nashville that she had a Color Me Country stage there. But yeah, people like Reese, Rhiannon Giddens, Don Flemons, who performed here yesterday, I believe.
Yeah,
A lot of people, Miko Marks, these people are bringing sort of, re-energizing country music with what they're doing, and sort of, bringing it back to a lot of its African American roots, which I think is a very positive thing.
Other questions? Yes.
This is separate, but I want to mention, since we're in Rockingham County, for Eddie, T. Michael Coleman grew up
Oh,
in
yeah.
Mayodan, and most of us from that area know him, and he played with Doc Watson, as you know, for many years, and I wondered if you had contact with him, or, and his use of an electric bass.
Oh, yeah,
As
yeah.
opposed to the acoustic.
Oh, he was kind of like me. He didn't grow up with country music. Unfortunately, he didn't work with me on the book. I kept trying to reach out to him. Several people, helped me make contact, but I never heard back from him. So, unfortunately, but know a lot of people who know T. Michael, and yeah, I've got quote from other sources from him. But yeah, he grew up with Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, and he was a rocker. And said he went into a music store in Boone when he was in school at Appalachian. And it was probably Gerald Little, who I talked to a lot for the book. He ran a music store in downtown Boone for decades. And I think it was his store. And maybe Doc had just won a Grammy, maybe, something like that. There was a display in the record store that said, Watauga County's own Doc Watson. And Coleman asked, who is that? I don't know anything about this guy. And so the guy gave him, some Doc records. It's like, go home and educate yourself, basically. And he got to be friends with Merle, Doc's son, and they kind of got involved in the same orbit. And at some point, Doc and Merle decided they wanted to add a bass to their sound. And so T. Michael showed up and they played a couple of songs, like, okay, be here tomorrow, and we're flying out to San Francisco, that kind of thing. I don't remember the exact details, but it was a very, very, very easy audition, and he ended up playing with Doc for the rest of his life.
Oh. Since you mentioned Mayodan, how many of you have ever heard a bluegrass song called "I'll Roll in My Sweet Baby's Arms"? Very well-known bluegrass song. The very first recording of that song was not Flatt and Scruggs, not Bill Monroe. It was done by a man from Mayodan, North Carolina, named Robert Buster Carter. He worked at a bottling plant there. And in 1931, he, along with Posey Rohr and Preston Young from Martinsville, recorded "I'll Roll in My Sweet Baby's Arms." Very first time it was ever put on a record. The Monroe brothers, Bill and Charlie, learned that song from that record. He's also on the Harry Smith anthology doing a song called "The Lazy Farmer Boy." And it's a fantastic, he sings it solo with just the fiddle, Posey Rohr playing the fiddle behind him, and Preston Young guitar. And if you get a hold of that, and he became a surveyor. I used to go visit him, he lived up at Sandy Ridge. He became a surveyor, and he's the man who surveyed Hanging Rock State Park in Stokes County. Too, but the very first, talking about musicians from Mayodan, Robert Buster Carter, "I'll Roll in My Sweet Baby's Arms," and "Lazy Farmer Boy." A wonderful musician, wonderful banjo player as well. No extra charge for that information.
Elizabeth, do you have something?
No, the topic was Mayodan, or?
No, she mentioned Mayodan, T. Michael Coleman. I just wanted to visit. There was another guy from Mayodan
Well,
too.
when I did the chapter on Doc Watson, who was another kind of amazing, because he is, Eddie, as you pointed out beforehand when we were chatting, he also went up to New York from rural North Carolina, and of course he was blind, which makes it even harder. Now, he had some people in New York kind of hosting him, which Charlie Poole didn't, but he had the blindness, so it's kind of even.
They did meet him at the bus station.
Yeah.
The Port Authority.
But these were, tough people who were very motivated and incredibly musically talented. In terms of Doc Watson chapter, I found David Holt to be really, and also I profiled him in the book as well. David Holt, who moved here from California, but whose ancestors ran, he believes, one of the mills in Alamance County. And he was enormously helpful. And did you interview him?
I did. Yeah, he's been a big help. Yeah.
And of course, I had a fantastic person to interview for the Charlie Poole chapter, and he's sitting at the end of the table. I think you're the world authority.
Well-
and a great resource, and I'm so glad you're coming out
Well,
with the
You're
updated book.
you're very kind. The only problem is it's difficult to get me to talk. I'm a pretty shy person, don't have much, don't have much to
Tell me
say.
about it.
Oh, I have a question for you. In
Sure.
terms of the music, you know, Charlie Poole, there was a crispness to it and a kind of a clip to it.
Yeah.
Do you think that growing up around the textile mills and hearing all those sounds influenced him musically?
I wouldn't have any idea. He just had that good, thick, accent that I had a friend of mine from down in eastern North Carolina who said to me one time, my grandfather talked just like Charlie Poole. So apparently that was a thing from that era, I guess, where guys spoke with that kind of clip. But he did have a sharp, crisp voice, and he was shot across the lips before he made his first records in the brawl with a police officer. And whether that affected him, I don't know. But he,
And he also had a serious hand injury.
his right hand was broken when his fingers across the top were all crooked. They were bent in because he took a bet from a guy one day when he was a teenager, and I have a picture of him in his baseball uniform. And he bet the guy he could catch a ball with his bare hand no matter how hard the guy threw it. And the guy threw it, and Charlie closed his hand too quick, and it broke all of his fingers. And they healed back crooked. You didn't run to the ER with broken fingers if you were a Linhead kid. You just suffered through it. And my dad said there was a cross-eyed guy who used to come to the house over there and wanted Charlie to teach him how to play the banjo. And my dad said I would stand out there and watch Charlie show him chords and stuff on the banjo. And he said, when Raymond asked Charlie, said, how can I learn to play the banjo? He said, Charlie said, well, first you got to break your fingers.
How bad do you want it, kid?
Yeah, right.
And, this is reminding me about, this kind of ties into your question about, the comment about African American, that when Charlie Poole grew up in Alamance County in Millboro, there was a musician there named Manly Reese, who people think, from the Historical Society in Alamance County, was probably the first white to learn clawhammer banjo. And I guess that was around, pre-1900 when he learned it. And so then Charlie Poole was playing clawhammer banjo, right? But then, or maybe he learned the three-finger style right off the bat, because I never knew about this banjo craze that took hold in Victorian America across the country, where the banjo was adopted by people like Wes Osman and Fred was
Fred
there,
Van
yeah.
Epps.
And it became
Fred
a
Van
middle-class parlor instrument that people would play in their middle-class, homes up in the parlor. And this was a craze. And that's when people across the Piedmont started playing in this three-finger style, correct? And I guess some people in the mountains were still playing the claw hammer. But so it seems to me that a lot of Charlie Poole's songs, he was taking Victorian-era songs, Tin Pan Alley songs, combined with his crisp kind of clipped voice. He almost sounded a little, he was not the down-home, thick Southern accent on many of his songs. It was more sophisticated, but I guess the record producer up in New York didn't think he was quite polished enough to have the Al Jolson sound to break into popular music, mainstream, which is what he wanted to do. But, so it's just really a great way to learn about things I didn't know about in American history, like this whole Victorian era three-finger banjo craze.
If you go back, and it really is I think a misnomer that people think that most of the old-time banjo players played clawhammer. The truth is, if you go back and listen to the recordings from the 1920s, people who had already learned to play the banjo before they ever entered a recording studio, Wilmer Watts, Charlie Poole, Buster Carter, Frank Jenkins, Doc Walsh, Clay Everhart. These are all people that made records from North Carolina in the 1920s. They all played fingerstyle banjo. They all picked the banjo with a thumb and one finger or a thumb and two fingers. So actually, the truth, I had a friend over at the house one day, Adam Hurt, who's a wonderful clawhammer banjo player, professional, and he wanted me to play some of my 78s. And I played him one after another, and he said, "But you haven't played me any clawhammer ones." I said, "That's because there weren't many of them." I said, "There weren't very many people who recorded playing clawhammer." Now there were, like Clarence Ashley. There was a guy named W.A. Hinton from Texas who did a beautiful version of Leather Breeches with clawhammer, and there were some. But the fact is, I told Adam, most of the banjo players, especially from North Carolina, were fingerstyle banjo players. And these were people who, you know, developed it some way. Charlie learned from a cousin, Dana Johnson, who was a fingerstyle banjo player. And really the fingerstyle, you know, it's no surprise that Earl Scruggs popularized the fingerstyle, because it was the style of North Carolina. It was the style of banjo playing. And if you go back and look at those pre-war banjo players, they nearly all fingerpicked the banjo. And I might add, in relation to African American music, there were in the 1920s a few white bands that had black fiddlers. There was a wonderful band from Kentucky called Taylor's Kentucky Boys, and their fiddler was a guy named Jim Booker, who was from Camp Nelson, Kentucky. And he played things like Gray Eagle and I'm trying to remember the other side of that, Soldier's Joy, Maxwell Girl, which is really Buffalo Gals, and he was a wonderful fiddler. There was a band from Alabama called the Dixie Ramblers. Their bass player in their band was a black man from Alabama. And you find some of that. And I used to ask my dad, I said, "What kind of records did Charlie Poole buy for his Columbia Graffanola there when you were a boy? What kind of records was he listening to?" He said he loved Blind Blake. And Blind Blake was a fantastic fingerstyle blues guitar player and singer, born in Virginia, moved down to Jacksonville, Florida, and then finally up to Illinois. And he was an incredible musician. And Daddy said Charlie loved Blind Blake's music. And Norman Woodleaf, who was a guitar player on Poole's first two records, I talked to Norman one time, and he said, "Yeah, I used to buy Blind Blake records." And on one of the records that Norman recorded with Kid Smith, he does this incredible Blind Blake lick on the end of the record. So there was a lot of cross-pollination,
And
I think.
I remember rereading my chapter last night, but I can't remember exactly what it was. But I think one of the songs was taught to, maybe it was Norman Woodleaf or someone from an African American
Yeah,
musician.
a guy named, we should have been seated side by side. A guy named Tyler Meeks that I used to go visit told me that he taught Charlie Poole the words to "Don't Let Your Deal Go Down," that big hit record of 102,000 copies. And Tyler said he learned them from an African American guitar player named Charlie Blackstock, who had grown up in Leakesville, but had moved up north somewhere. And he said he came home. Tyler was very specific about it. He said he came home for a visit with his family in the summer of 1911, in June of 1911. Tyler was that kind of person. And he said he came to visit his family in June of 1911, and I went over to hear him play, and said he played "Don't Let Your Deal Go Down." And he said, when I encountered Charlie Poole the first time, I taught him the words that I had learned from Charlie Blackstock, the blues musician. So it wasn't as cut and dried as we might think. There was cross-pollination. I think they did listen to each other and, more importantly, learn from each other and shared. I know there was a African-American banjo player up at Leatherwood, which is not far from Eden, that they recorded back in the 1970s, and he was playing and singing "I'm the Man That Rode the Mule Around the World," which was Charlie Poole's second record. So obviously he had heard Charlie Poole's record of that, because Charlie made up that song, and he had learned that off Charlie's record. So again, it went both ways there
Well,
too.
this is going to sound,
Just real quickly, there's a guy named Roy Bookbinder,
Yeah.
a blues musician, and the thing he says about that is, Whether or not they called something country or blues usually had to do with the color of the person at the do we have any more questions up there? We're good. One more and then, yeah.
I'm Kinney Rorrer's first wife, and I get to go in free passes on everything. I don't play anything. I have no discernible talents, except I'm bilingual, which is not really practical at bluegrass festivals or old time either. But I wanted to share that Friday night I got to sit in the green room or the practice room, and I watched Jaron Paxton meet Jeremy Stevens for the first time. We've known Jeremy Stevens since he was a little boy. Both of them are enormously talented. Standing on the other side of them, Dom Flemings, who also, I don't think he knew Jaron before, I'm not sure, but it's magical to watch what happens when you get three multi-talented people. And Jaron started picking a banjo. And Jeremy said, oh, I like that. So he went over and picked up a guitar. And now they're playing the same song. And Dom said, oh, I can do this. And he gets his spoons out of his thing and starts with the spoons. And they were just going crazy. And I thought, maybe this is sexist, but honestly, I don't see three women doing that. Unless they were musicians. But you put three unknown women in a room who are experts on different things, maybe. But I think that music is an avenue. And I asked Paxton, I said, how did you end up here? And he said, I was playing Fats Waller in New York City. He plays stride piano. Well, I used to know what stride piano was before I hooked up with a banjo player. So we could talk about Fats Waller a little bit, but he is moving into this area, and I find musicians are more open than ordinary people to new influences. And if anybody wants to see that, the one thing I can do is make videotapes. So I have a videotape of that little segment when they were playing together. And I'll tell you, Paxton was so excited. He was saying, one more time, let's do it one more time. And they were just magical. So I think there's a lot of positive, a lot of good hope in this music and in these musicians. We're all God's children, although I think the musicians are kind of his favorite.
I think that's a lovely note to close on. So I want to thank everybody for coming. They have books outside and there's cake. So grab yourself a slice.
Thank you all for coming. Just to reiterate, I want to thank the North Carolina Humanities for helping us put together this program and giving us some copies of Step It Up and Go to give out to some people. Some of you are in the audience. I hope you've read it. Do go purchase some of the books, get them signed. Also, thanks to the town of Wentworth. They sponsor a lot of the programs that we do here at the museum. And thanks to Louise Price, who unfortunately was too tired to be here after 2 days of running the Charlie Pool Festival. Louise was the one who got me in touch with Dave. And a special thanks to Dave for putting this program together and organizing it. And if you see Joyce Hales, who just walked into the door frame right there, she has been working very hard for the museum all week. Actually, really all month, for the past month, helping us get ready for the Charlie Pool Festival the past couple days and for this event today. We could not have been done without Joyce.
What are you signing, Dick?
The book signings will be outside.